All right, let's talk about Rawls's theory of justice. So Rawls, in his book, A Theory of Justice, which was really influential, was arguing for a certain view about how people should roughly write constitutions or decide about the basic institutions that make up a society. But it's not that hard to turn Rawls's theory of constitution writing into a theory of moral decision making in general. So, to start out, you can see that a lot of our obligations to one another intuitively come from promises and agreements and deals and plans that we make with one another, which we can call, just in a nutshell, contracts. So, usually when I make a promise to you, or when I make a deal with you, or when I make a plan with you, unless I've got a good excuse or something changes or something like that, I'm obligated to follow through with you. Okay. The problem is that we don't always meet as equals when we're negotiating these contracts. So, if I want to negotiate a raise with my boss, I basically have very little or no leverage unless I'm, an extraordinarily rare worker, or it's a really tight labor market, or I can blackmail my boss. My boss basically gets to call the shots. So we can come to an agreement, we can make a contract, but I have very little say in what that contract is going to look like. My boss can either give me a raise or not. Right, the other problem. So one way that a contract can sort of be unfair, or that people can fail to meet as equals, is that one party to the contract, one person negotiating the contract, can have a lot of power over the other person, have a lot of leverage over the other person, and not vice versa. Another way that contracts can be unfair is there can be what economists sometimes call informational asymmetries. So one party to the contract knows a lot about what's going on, and the other party does not know a lot about what's going on. So, you might call over an electrician to your house. There's some weird buzzing sound, and the lights keeps flicking on and off, and you say, hey buddy, I need some help with this. Can you give me a hand? And the electrician looks around and says, yeah, okay, that's going to be $1,000. Well, who are you to negotiate with the electrician? I mean, in a competitive market, yes, you can go to other electricians, and that's possible. But at least in that specific negotiation situation, the electrician knows a lot about the true costs of the repair, and you know nothing about the true costs of the repair. That is why you called the electrician. So that's one way that a contract that people freely negotiate between one another could be unfair, is if one party knows what's going on and one party doesn't. Okay. So that leads to this question sort of naturally. Can you imagine a situation where whatever contracts people negotiated, the contracts would automatically be fair? And Rawls says yes. He calls this imaginary bargaining situation the veil of ignorance. And in the veil of ignorance, basic facts about human psychology, basic facts about the situation in which you're negotiating this contract, the thing that the contract is about. If I was negotiating a contract with the electrician from behind the veil of ignorance, I would know that there's this electrical problem. I would know a thing or two about the actual electrical problem itself. I would know the going rates for various forms of electrical work, and so on. I would know roughly what I needed to know in order to make this decision about what to pay the electrician. The one thing I wouldn't know is who I was going to be when I left the bargaining table, when I get out of the veil of ignorance. Am I going to be the electrician, or am I going to be the customer? Okay, so in the veil of ignorance, you know roughly what you need to know in order to negotiate the contract. The one thing you don't know is who you are going to be when the veil of ignorance is lifted. Which party to the contract will you be? Okay, this is a very strange thing to imagine, but run with it for a second. So why would Rawls think that any contract that came out of the veil of ignorance would automatically be a fair one? Well, think about it. People behind the veil of ignorance can't use their special power or social position or extraordinary leverage or anything like that to exploit you. Your boss can't say, well, I'm the boss, so I'm going to negotiate a deal which is more favorable to me, because your boss doesn't know that they're the boss from behind the veil of ignorance. So because you don't know your own social position, you don't know where you are located in society, which party to the contract you are going to be from behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know how to, and you can't, exploit your social position to come up with a contract which is disproportionately beneficial to you and people like you. On the other hand, you also can't exploit any informational asymmetries because you don't know who you are. Your social position has sort of been erased from behind the veil of ignorance. You can't say, well, I'm the electrician. I really know what's going on here. So, I can, say, there's a problem with the doohickey and this person has no idea. And so I can get this poor schmuck to pay me $1 zillion for some very cheap repair. That's not how it works. Behind the veil of ignorance, there are no informational asymmetries. Okay, so Rawls has a very plausible case that any contract that people would agree to from behind the veil of ignorance would automatically be a fair one. Makes a lot of sense. So there is the first part of Rawls's moral theory. We can call it Rawls 1.0. And it says that a law or a policy or a rule is just if it is something that we would agree to from behind the veil of ignorance. Let's just give one example here to see how this would work in action. So in much of the United States, though not in New York City, the local public school system is funded by local property taxes. Now think about this. What this means is that in places with very high property values, that is to say in places where people are rich, the schools are going to be very well funded. And in places with low property values, the schools are going to be relatively poorly funded. Well, this has this absurd consequence that poor people get shittier schools than rich people. After all, you could say, this doesn't make any sense. If anything, rich people can, as a rule, afford to go to private school, so they need public school even less than poor people. And of course, they already are doing just well enough in life, and they'll be educated by their parents in one way or another, or maybe they won't be educated, but they'll get some inheritance. They don't need the assistance of the public schools in the way that poor people do. So you might say, behind the veil of ignorance, if you didn't know you were going to be rich or poor, but you knew that you're more likely to be poor than to be rich, you'd say, why on earth would I fund local public schools with property taxes? This is just going to make things worse for me if I'm poor, and it's only going to give me this relatively small marginal benefit if I am rich. Okay, there you go. So you can sort of see how the veil of ignorance would sort of work in action, how it could kind of be used to justify more egalitarian, more fair public policy. Okay, so that's Rawls 1.0. A law or policy or rule is just if it's the sort of law or policy or rule we would agree to from behind the veil of ignorance. But Rawls doesn't stop there. But wait, there's more. Okay. Rawls says not just that the veil of ignorance is this ideal bargaining situation. Rawls also makes some further claims about how people would reason from behind the veil of ignorance. And his idea, mainly, is that people would want to avoid being completely screwed. They would say, I don't know who I'm going to be, but I could be one of the least well-off or most vulnerable members of society. And if that happens, I want to make sure that things aren't awful for me. I want to make sure that whatever society does, it protects the least vulnerable and most vulnerable and least well off. Okay, so Rawls says there are two things people would agree to two principles of justice that people would agree to from behind the veil of ignorance to protect the least well-off, most vulnerable members of society. The first principle is a principle about rights, and the principle is that everybody has as many human rights as they can that are compatible with everyone else having those rights. So if you're having some right is roughly compatible with everyone else having that right, then you've got it. You have a right to freedom of speech, you have a right to an education because my having that right is consistent with everybody else's having that right. You do not have the right to live in my apartment because it's not possible for everyone to live in my apartment. It's not possible for everyone to have the right to live here. The apartment just isn't that big. Okay, so this is the first principle. It's a principle of equal and maximal rights. Incidentally, this helps answer one of the objections to rights-based theories that we considered in the last video, which is the objection, where do rights come from? And Rawls could say they come from the veil of ignorance, and this is the sort of principle that tells you whether a right exists or doesn't. Okay. The other principle that he says exists is a little bit harder to understand, but it's called the difference principle. And the difference principle says that increases in inequality in a society are justified only if they benefit the least well-off members of society. So here are a few possible distributions of, let's say, happiness in a society. So here's the least well-off members of society. Here's the most well-off members of society. So this is perfect equality right here. Okay, maybe I'll put my hands a little low. Here's perfect equality right here. Sounds pretty good. Everybody's equal. That's great. Here's another distribution of happiness in a society. This is the least well-off members of society are doing just as well as they do under perfect equality. This is the most well-off members of society, and they're doing great. They're batting 1,000. They're winning big. I don't know, whatever rich people do. However they talk about how happy they are. Okay, so this distribution maximizes total well-being, at least out of the options that we're considering. Now consider this distribution. So there's some increase in inequality from from the first distribution, from total equality. There's also a lower total amount of happiness than there was in the utilitarian distribution that we just considered. But this is the distribution which, out of the three that we've considered, the difference principle recommends. Why does it recommend it? Because while there is some increase in inequality, that increase in inequality benefits our friends over here, the least well-off members of society. Okay? So Rawls says we wouldn't agree to the utilitarian distribution because you wouldn't want to be the totally screwed least well-off member of society, and we wouldn't agree to the total equality because, well, total equality screws you even more than the difference principle distribution, the third distribution that we considered. Okay. There are lots of objections to Rawls that we could consider. One is, does the veil of ignorance make sense? Do people, is it even, it's a weird thing to imagine, but is it even a coherent thing to imagine? Okay, that's one objection. Another objection is, Rawls says that people from behind the veil of ignorance would focus almost exclusively, it seems, on the interests of the least well-off members of society. But why would you do that? Let's consider a fourth distribution of happiness in a society. So here was our third distribution, the difference principle distribution. Now let's consider one more distribution. I'm just going to raise this hand really, really high. This distribution, the least well-off members of society are doing just as well as they were doing under the difference principle, but another group is doing really, really well. You could say, wouldn't it just be sort of spiteful or mean or cruel to say that the best off members of society can't get this additional happiness because it doesn't benefit the least well off members of society? Doesn't that just seem like a kind of nasty or small-minded thing? And for that matter, if you were behind the veil of ignorance, forget about nastiness or small-mindedness, wouldn't you say, well, I want to maximize what economists and decision theorists call expected utility. I want to maximize my chances of doing well in the society, of being happiest. And the distribution that's going to maximize expected utility will not be the difference principal distribution. So if you want to have your best chances of doing well, you won't just focus on the least well-off members of society, you'll focus on, everybody. Okay, so those are some objections to Rawls. On the one hand, that the veil of ignorance is really hard to imagine, maybe doesn't make any sense, and on the other hand, that Rawls 2.0, Rawls's version of, or vision of what people would agree to from behind the veil of ignorance, is weirdly focused on the least well-off members of society. And maybe if Rawls got the veil of ignorance right, people would actually make decisions in a utilitarian way from behind the veil of ignorance, rather than just focusing on the least well-off members of society. Okay, there you go. Oh, fuck. I was trying to remember to use the objection owl. Again, I forgot 3 times in a row to use the objection owl. It's okay. It's okay.